Hello, I've got another pallet wood project for you. I took an old pallet and made this lamp, and I'm going to show you how I did it. For this project, I used 3 boards from an old pallet someone was throwing away, some 1/4-inch plywood, some 1/4-inch steel rod, a porcelain lamp holder, a lamp cord that came with a rotary switch pre-installed, and an old-timey light bulb. My pallet boards were about 3.5 inches wide, but I cut them in half. I used my homemade router table with a 1/8 inch spiral bit. This is not an ideal way to rip boards, but it's about the only way I can do it, so I did it this way. A table saw or even a bandsaw would be much better, but sometimes you have to make do with what you have. Then I used the same setup to cut the plywood into a 6.5 inch square. The router cut through this thinner material much easier than it cut through the thicker pallet wood and left a much nicer edge. Then I sanded the pallet wood starting with 80 grit, going to 120 grit, and finally 220 grit sandpaper. I wanted a rustic look, so I really wasn't trying to get the board super flat and smooth. I dropped the router bit down to 1/8 inch and cut a dado 1 inch from one side of one of the boards. I wanted the 1/4 inch plywood to fit into this dado to form the bottom of the lamp, so I moved the fence over a tad and ran the boards again. Then I cut the boards with a miter saw at 45-degree angle. I used 5 boards and cut each into 4 pieces. Each piece was 6 inches on the inside edge and 7 inches on the outside edge. Then I glued 4 pieces together to form a square. I have these belt clamps that work really well for gluing up frames and boxes like this, but I only have 2, so I could only do 2 at a time. I forgot to put the plywood into the bottom layer, but luckily I remembered before the glue completely dried and I was able to pull it apart. I inserted the plywood and re-glued that layer and everything ended up okay. After all 5 layers were glued, I let them dry overnight. The next morning I sanded them down with 220 grit sandpaper again. I needed to drill holes in the corners of each layer for 4 pieces of steel rod to fit through. A drill press would have been really helpful here, but I don't have one, so what I did was I used a little wooden square to help keep my bit vertical. I used some double-sided tape to help keep it in place. I drilled the second layer first, and once it was drilled, I used it as a guide to drill the 3rd layer. Then I used the 3rd layer as a guide to drill the 4th layer. I wanted the ends of the rod hidden, so I didn't drill all the way through the wood on the top and bottom layers. I only drilled 1 inch deep. I used the 2nd layer as a guide for the bottom. I used the 4th layer as a guide for the top. There are 2 screws on the bottom of the lamp holder and they stick out a little bit, so I needed a way to raise the lamp holder up a bit. I cut 2 small pieces of leftover plywood and glued them into place to act as risers. When they were completely dry, I marked where I wanted the mounting holes and drilled them all the way through the double layer of plywood. Then I marked where I wanted a hole for the cord and drilled that hole at a slight downward angle. I measured and cut the steel rod into 4 8.5-inch pieces. I tried using a hacksaw first, but that was too slow, so I switched over to my Dremel with a cutoff wheel, and that went much faster. To attach the wood to the steel rods, I used PC7, which is a metal reinforced paste epoxy with a long working time. Link in the description. I mixed up some PC7 and applied some to the holes in the bottom layer and put the rods into the holes. Then I slid the second layer into place, which took a little bit of finagling because my holes weren't lined up quite perfectly, but they were good enough. I slid a couple pieces of 1/2-inch scrap wood between the layers to keep them separate while I applied PC7 to each of the steel rods. Then I removed all but one of the pieces of scrap wood and slid the second layer into place. I continued like this with all the layers, keeping one piece of 1/2-inch wood between the layers to act as spacers. I used my bare hand to apply the PC7, but supposedly it can irritate your skin, so you might want to wear gloves. PC7 needs 24 hours to cure completely. I finished the wood with tung oil finish, which I like. I applied one coat, let it dry overnight, sanded it with double-aught steel wool, and applied a second coat. There isn't much room inside the lamp, so I'm going to demonstrate how I did the wiring. The cord I bought came with a little lamp holder on one end, and I just cut that off. Then I split the two wires and stripped the end of each. One wire is hot and the other is neutral. The hot wire is usually marked with ink or, like in this case, stamped letters. The hot wire connects to the thin prong on the plug and the neutral wire goes to the fat prong. On this lamp holder, the hot wire should be connected to the bronze screw and the neutral wire should be connected to the silver screw. I fed the wires up through the hole in the back of the lamp and wired up the lamp holder. The lamp holder came with 2 mounting bolts, but they weren't long enough, so I replaced them with longer ones and also added a couple of washers and a couple of nuts. Then I added a bulb, and the lamp was complete. So I think the lamp turned out really cool, kind of rustic, maybe even a little steampunky. I hope you liked the video, found it helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. You can also subscribe to keep up to date with my newest videos, or follow me on Twitter at Makeify1. Thanks for watching. Hello, I made this lamp. Nope. No. Keep up to date with my newest videos, or follow me at Twitter. Follow me at Twitter? No. If you like the... Ooh, better idea.